So as it was mentioned, I'm going to talk about cannabis prohibition, the war on drugs, how it fits into libertarian-based values, and what I really think the Libertarian Party could capitalize on by making this a really solid part of their platform. It was mentioned in the previous speaker about how ending the war on drugs, legalizing cannabis are starting to become more and more popular ideas. But it is still kind of an outlandish thought when you want to go and talk about legalizing heroin or legalizing methamphetamine or LSD. If you wanted to get some good media coverage, you could easily hold a press conference about how you as a candidate feel that legalizing something like heroin would be better for public safety, it would be better for taxpayers, and really because it's such a complex issue and it's so far-fetched in so many concerned citizens' minds, you won't be able to put that out there without getting some type of attention from the media. They may try and spin it a certain way, but that's part of their job. Whether you want to actually believe in that or whether you want to actually put that forward, that's up to each candidate and each person's position and opinion. I really got into this movement early on when I was in high school and I was learning about the history of alcohol prohibition, and then my next class was a class on drug education, and they were equating heroin to cannabis, and they really weren't talking that much about alcohol prohibition, but it was real clear for me to see the parallels between alcohol prohibition, gangsterism, corruption, and what we currently have as the war on drugs. So I'm going to give a brief overview of what we're doing here in Illinois. I'll expand that upon what the war on drugs really looks like now, how it's going to be shifting in the next 10 years, I would predict, and then and kind of tie that into liberty-based values and the political opportunity that really exists to capitalize on this changing public opinion and this changing policy. I am a lobbyist in Springfield for full disclosure. What that means is that when I make campaign contributions to elected officials, I have to report it in a way that's usually different than what most citizens have to report. I don't really take a lot of pride in that. It really was something that I was told I needed to do once when I started spending significant amount of time at the Capitol as a concerned citizen looking to change laws. I'm not a six-figure lobbyist. In fact, I'm a volunteer lobbyist, if you can imagine such a thing actually exists. Because if you start engaging in the political and legislative process, and you start working to actually change laws significantly enough, the people at the Capitol in Springfield start to take notice and they want you to play by their rules and follow their regulations, and you need to register as a lobbyist then, and twice a month I have to submit expenditure reports saying that I have given absolutely nothing to any of these political candidates, despite the fact that I'm trying to change these laws. So I know the previous speaker talked about the war on drugs. I was really happy to hear that. And just to kind of gauge where the room is at, is there anybody in here who feels that legalizing cannabis or legalizing drugs is the wrong approach to take for these substances? Well, wonderful. I love it when the audience, it no longer becomes a persuasive speech. It becomes more of an explanation of why this is going to work and why this is something that people should get behind. Essentially, the costs of incarceration are just too much at this point for states like Illinois and many others to really handle. A lot of people don't realize that in Illinois we don't have what is known as a decriminalized cannabis state. There are certain cities and municipalities that have decriminalized cannabis, like Chicago, Sugar Grove, Champaign, and a lot of the college towns. But no matter where you are, even if you're in one of these decriminalized municipalities, the state law in Illinois is that if you have less than 2.5 grams of cannabis, which basically is anything, if you have a roach, a seed, or a stem in your car or your pocket, you're still subject to arrest under the Illinois Cannabis Control Act. A lot of people don't know that. I get phone calls all the time from people traveling through Illinois who get caught with a joint and they get arrested and they realize, well, I thought I would just get a ticket if somebody found this on me, but that is not the case. We do have one of the more strictest laws, I would say, when it comes to cannabis policy in Illinois. If you look at our driving under the influence of drugs laws, it is one of the most restrictive in the country. We have a per se zero tolerance limit on driving under the influence of drugs, which means that if you have any trace metabolites of cannabis in your system, you are guilty of driving under the influence of drugs. And a real brief health orientation here is that cannabis is fat soluble. The compounds in cannabis are called cannabinoids. This is significantly different than substances like alcohol, cocaine, methamphetamine, or heroin, where those other substances will pretty much be out of your system within 24 hours of abstaining from usage of them. Whereas cannabis, because it's a fat-soluble substance, depending on your body fat content and how frequent of a consumer you are, it can stay in your system anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks. And what that means in all practical terms is that you can go to Colorado next week, consume cannabis legally in the state of Colorado, come back to Illinois, get into a car accident 3 weeks later with a fatality, and they will automatically draw your blood. You will be guilty of DUID if you have that metabolite still in your system, and you will be charged with aggravated DUID, which is a manslaughter charge essentially. And we do know of cases where young people have admitted to consuming cannabis the week prior. They were involved in a traffic fatality. They were charged and convicted of these aggravated DUID charges, and they're currently serving 3 to 5 year sentences from the handful of people that stories we've known about. And all that obviously adds up to incarceration costs as well as an additional burden on taxpayers. Another thing that a lot of folks don't really know about here in Illinois is the Class X felony charge. Who here is familiar with the Class X felony? Anybody? This is like a new crime that they passed, I'd say maybe 10 years ago. It was really supposed to be reserved for only the most heinous of crimes and criminals. You're talking about, you know, multiple child pedophilia offenses, mass murderers, you know, those type of things. What we're noticing is that there's a lot of state's attorneys in central and southern Illinois who use those Class X charges against large-scale drug dealers. So for instance, about 8 years ago, there was a prison guard who forwarded us a story of an inmate that he was overseeing who was 19 at the time, but he was sentenced when he was 18. He had 3 convictions for cannabis trafficking. Essentially, his mother lived in California and was mailing him pounds of cannabis in Decatur to sell because he wasn't making any money working at the local fast food chain. He ended up getting caught. His mother got caught. His mother got probation in California. The judge said that he was going to make an example of him, sentenced him for 12 years for the Class X felony, 10 years for the Class 1 felony, and an additional 3 years for a Class 2 felony. So that 18-year-old has now been sentenced to a 33-year sentence. He's going to be up for parole in approximately 4 years here, having done 11 years of that 33-year sentence. And that case is you know, one that we've really highlighted. We're working with the governor to try and get a commutation of that sentence. But when you look at the cost of incarceration, about $24,000 per year per inmate, depending on if they're in a maximum or a minimum security prison, you can start to do that math and really see how much that number adds up to a burden on taxpayers. And again, these are non-violent offenders. This kid wasn't using a gun in the drug dealing transactions that he was engaging in. He was simply selling cannabis to people that wanted to buy cannabis in the Decatur area. However, he did get caught, and he now is serving that sentence. We've also been told of other people who are serving similar sentences for Class X convictions. Illinois does allow for a court supervision for a first offender. Nevertheless, if you're not a first offender, they will throw the book at you and trump up these charges so that they can get a reduced plea deal. One of the other aspects of incarceration that I think is very important, especially for libertarian values, is that when these criminals are released back into society and they're labeled as a felon, it's very difficult for them to get work. It's very difficult for them to find housing in a lot of cases. So what you have is a significant burden on an entire class of people in terms of finding employment. And after a felon is released and they've done their time, they've paid their debt to society, when they go try and find a job and they have to check a box saying that they're a convicted felon, they never get a call back from that employer. We have done some work as an organization with other organizations to try and get some of those employer questionnaires about are you a felon removed from the applications so that employers could actually interview somebody and ask that question without making it an actual question on the application, so that somebody might actually be able to get an interview from that employer It's met with extreme resistance from another groups, obviously. But that type of felony unemployment rate in Illinois, that all adds up to the burden on taxpayers because those people can't find work. They get on the social services rolls. They start getting food stamps. They start getting a financial stipend. And that's something that if they weren't labeled as a felon, they probably could find some type of work. And I think that that's something that a lot of people who favor small government, and a lot of people who even favor ending the war on drugs or cannabis prohibition, they really don't look at that felony disenfranchisement or how those numbers really add up to a burden on taxpayers, and that money could really be spent in other places like schools, roads, or a number of different avenues. But I think that that's something that people really should consider as well. If we're going to label people as a felon, what does that mean when they get released from prison? Because it is a significant challenge for them to find any type of meaningful work. And again, with the concept of where these ideas fit into the libertarian perspective. And I know I, for one, believe that adults in a free country should have the freedom to be adults and to engage in adult activities. Absent a harm or endangerment to others, there's no reason why people shouldn't be able to consume drugs, whether it's cannabis, whether it's chocolate, coffee, or LSD, or any of the other designer drugs that are now starting to become more popular, especially among young people. There's a wonderful publication I would say to read if you're interested on learning how these different substances could be regulated. It's from a UK organization called Transform, but the name of the book is Blueprint for Regulation After the War on Drugs. And they outline how these different classes of drugs, whether they're psychedelics, whether it's cannabis, they can be regulated in different ways. And just to kind of give you a teaser of that, something like LSD, that is a psychedelic, it allows people to hallucinate, it can significantly impair one's reality. The way that you could legalize that is by having it being consumed and distributed through clubs or through social groups where you could be in a facility that you're allowed to consume this, you're forced to stay there for 8 to 12 hours until the substances wear off. It's your choice to consume it. You would have to agree to be willing to stay there for 12 hours, but then you'd be free to go after that 12 hours and your experience has really ended. An additional benefit of legalizing drugs in terms of public safety is that you have a product then that has a standard of quality that's attached to it. And again, this comes back to what I was learning in high school and alcohol prohibition, where you had a substance that a lot of people wanted to consume, but there wasn't any regulatory oversight over the substances. So you had people making gin in their bathtubs, just like you have people making methamphetamine now in campers and trailers in rural parts of America. And all of these things, through legalization, you'll be able to provide that regulatory framework. You'll be able to provide that quality assurance so that there aren't impurities or other substances tainting the substances that somebody thinks that they're getting. You're also able to better control who it is that's selling these substances, because there's not a drug dealer in America that's going to ask you for an age ID card if you go to buy drugs from them. If I go to walk into a gas station or a bar, there's a good chance that somebody might ask me for my ID to prove that I'm old enough to be consuming those substances. But the guys selling drugs on the street corners, the kids selling pot in their parents' basement, none of them are asking for IDs. None of them are required to go through any type of licensing program to sell those substances. Through legalization, you can change all of that. You can have only licensed dealers. Yes, ma'am.
I think two important aspects of legalization related to the way libertarians see things is we believe that you own your own body. That if you don't own your own body, what do you own? And therefore, you have the right to do with it as you please. But the flip side of this, and this is very, very important in terms of libertarian thinking, is that when you exercise these kinds of freedoms, you also take responsibility for what you are doing. And so it is not okay to be taking all of this stuff and then expect, if you have something negative happen, like you're now strung out or you can no longer function due to psychedelics or something like that, that then you expect society to take care of you. We don't accept that. If you're going to use these freedoms, then you need to take the responsibility for the consequences of the use of those freedoms.
I agree. We're not looking to have people be irresponsibly using these substances. We're not looking to have people irresponsibly endangering others through their substance. You can start advocating for, say, drug testing people on welfare. However, if you look at the numbers in Florida, it costs significantly more to drug test people than whatever savings you'll find from people who are using substances and still trying to get on those type of welfare rolls. But there's nothing that says that we are advocating for people to irresponsibly use these substances. And that's part of the privilege or allowance of being an adult in this country. There's nothing that says that I can't just become a raging alcoholic and drink myself to death every single night of my life. There's nothing that prevents me from also doing that and getting on welfare. And if you look at the way that most people consider welfare recipients, they generally think that they're just lazy people that don't want to work. And while that may be the case for some folks, there are other people who have significant challenges engaging in a social society like this who probably should be on our welfare rolls so that they're not forced to steal to feed themselves or rob people to get money to feed themselves. And I would make the same case for things like prostitution. You legalize prostitution, you're able to better control it, you're better able to test people for STDs, you're able to provide that type of oversight so that when somebody is engaging in that line of work that there's some type of repercussions for the people that are abusing them or endangering or harming those type of folks. And I think the concept here is that we don't really want a nanny state government that's going to try and protect us from ourselves. But we do want some type of oversight so that we can be protected from those people that are looking to endanger and harm us. Every time somebody dies from a drinking and driving accident, it really doesn't renew this debate for let's go back to alcohol prohibition. And we're going to see this happen in Colorado where they have legalized cannabis. There may be some instances of people engaging in that behavior recklessly or endangering or even harming and killing other people. But for every one of those instances, there's probably hundreds of instances of that not happening. So just because you might hear some stories of Colorado of the negative aspects of legalization doesn't mean that we should really go back to this system of prohibition. Prohibition doesn't work. You're not going to find many people that advocate for it working. The one conversation I had with somebody who does think that alcohol prohibition worked, he was citing cases of liver cirrhosis that were prevented. And how you come up with those numbers, I'm not sure, but this person also was a major investor in the drug testing industry, and that was his motivation for keeping something like cannabis illegal. And if you look at the drug testing industry, their bread and butter is something like cannabis that stays in the body much longer than other drugs and other substances. And because cannabis is a plant, I think that most people in this room would agree that it's not the government's job to be fooling around in my vegetable garden looking at what type of plants I have, and if they happen to find one that they don't like, that I'm going to get arrested, possibly lose my property, which is another aspect here that I'm going to start touching on with the civil asset forfeitures. Who's familiar with civil asset forfeitures? Oh, wonderful. I'm so glad. If it would have been less than that, I would have been disappointed. Just a real brief 101 for people who don't know what they are. Civil asset forfeitures are a way for the government to quite literally steal your property. If they feel that that property was acquired or purchased through illegal means, i.e. you're a drug dealer driving a fancy Cadillac and you're 17, you don't have any way to legally prove that you earned that money to buy that Cadillac, the government can come in and seize that Cadillac from you and force you in civil court to prove that you purchased that Cadillac through money that was acquired legally. What that means is that you have a burden now to prove that you got this through a legal means, whereas in a criminal court, the burden is on the state. You're innocent until proven guilty. People are familiar with that concept. That's not the case in civil court. The other aspect of civil asset forfeiture is that you don't actually need to be convicted of any type of crime. They don't need to find that 17-year-old in possession of MDMA or LSD or anything to think that he's a drug dealer. They just need to think he's 17, he probably can't afford a Cadillac. Let's take this from him and force him in civil court to prove that he was able to buy this through his nest egg fund or his parents or something like that. The other aspect of civil asset forfeiture that a lot of people don't talk about, you don't hear anything on the Republican Party about this, is that it's illegal now to have large sums of cash on you. If you're driving across the country with a duffel bag with $10,000 in it and the police pull you over and find $10,000 cash, there's a good chance they're not going to let you drive away with that $10,000 cash. And they will take it and they will force you in civil court to prove that you got that $10,000 from a legal means. And you better believe that that goes directly against the libertarian values that this country was founded on. What kind of government is it that says if you have a lot of cash, not in a bank, but just on your person, on your body, it now is suspect that you are a criminal in some way. And a criminal only to the regard that that money is a criminal or that money has been obtained through crime. It has absolutely nothing to do with whether you're white, black, whether you're male or female. It's just the fact that you are an American who has a large amount of money on you. It doesn't matter if you sit here and say that the banks are corrupt, and that's why I don't keep my money in the bank. And that's something that has all been done in the name of the war on drugs, in the name of protecting Americans from themselves. The other aspect of civil asset forfeiture that's really worth talking about is that it has become a fundraising mechanism for local law enforcement agencies. When they can obtain that amount of money or that amount of assets through just basic forfeiture and through essentially stealing, they don't need to go to the state, they don't need to go to the county and ask for more money. They can just go out and acquire it themselves. And when you start talking about changing our asset forfeiture laws, I can tell you from conversations I've had with the lobbyists for the Illinois Sheriff's Association, the Illinois Chiefs of Police, you start changing your asset forfeiture laws, you start changing our drug laws in general, they know that that's going to affect their budgets, they know that that's going to affect the jobs that they have on their rosters right now. And for them, their jobs as lobbyists or union bosses is to protect those jobs. When we were working on the medical cannabis legislation, we had many conversations with the Illinois Department of Corrections union about medical cannabis. And you might say, well, what do the prison guards have anything to do with medical cannabis? Well, the prison guards knew that if we were to legalize medical cannabis, there was a chance that there might be fewer people getting arrested and convicted of cannabis-related offenses, and that would be fewer prison inmates in those beds and in those cells. And when you have fewer inmates in beds and cells in prisons, there's a renewed call to close some of these prisons. And that's a lot of jobs created, that's a lot of jobs that will be lost, that's a lot of jobs that in central and southern Illinois, there isn't a replacement there. And I've opined and argued plenty of times that if you look at the history of the war on drugs in this country, as well as some of our free labor trade agreements in the late 1970s and through the 1980s, as a lot of our manufacturing jobs started to get shipped to cheaper labor markets, the penalties for drug crimes were starting to be increased. And what ended up happening was in some of these towns where the only job in town was a factory, the factory got closed, all of a sudden we started increasing penalties for crack cocaine. That town then built a prison, and that town is now dependent on that prison for its livelihood. And if you start going to change some of these drug laws, you are literally talking about closing some of these prisons, you're talking about taking away that lifeline from some of these towns. And we know this for a fact in places like Vandalia, Illinois, Menard, Illinois, Taylorville, Illinois, Lincoln, Illinois. There's not any type of economy there other than the prison. So if you close that prison, you're taking away that lifeline from that town, and that costs people's jobs, that takes food off the table. And that's something that we know that by advocating for the positions that we're advocating for, that there's going to be some significant resistance in those communities. Even if they might personally believe in the cause that we're fighting for, they're not going to want to take food off of their neighbor's table. They're not going to want to compromise that neighbor's job. And that's why for us, we really have seen the prison industrial complex be a replacement economy for the manufacturing sector in a lot of the parts of rural Illinois and rural America for that matter. Nobody has really written a book extensively about that specific topic, but you can look at the numbers on the jobs that were getting shipped overseas and how the factories were closing. At the same time, we were increasing penalties for nonviolent drug crimes, and that led to a boom in the prison building industry. And those prisons now have a significantly entrenched interest to keep these drug crimes the way that they are. And those are some of the bigger opponents that we have advocating for the work that I do in Springfield. You know, the Illinois Department of Corrections, the Illinois Chiefs of Police Association, the Illinois County Sheriffs, the Illinois State Police, and that's not even to take into account the regional metropolitan enforcement groups, which are kind of a quasi-federal state organization that doesn't really have any oversight. They're not directly part of the DEA, they're not directly part of any type of county sheriff's office or local police board. These are essentially independent law enforcement groups that are strictly aimed at interdiction of drugs in some of these metropolitan regions. And it's gotten to the point where some of them have even stepped on the toes of some of the local law enforcement agencies. There was a notorious incident of the State Line Area Narcotics Trafficking Group, SLANT was their acronym, where they basically diverted all the traffic off of I-90 just north of Rockford to try and intercept drugs going from Chicago to Madison, Wisconsin. And they did that without notifying the county sheriff or the local chief of police. And when the local county sheriff found out that all of the traffic off of I-90 was being rerouted off an on-ramp to try and do a drug interdiction stop, the county sheriff felt that his authority had been overstepped, and he actually advocated for that MEG group to be disbanded because of it, because they weren't working in cooperation with the local authorities. So you can start to see how some of the lack of accountability of some of these drug enforcement groups is also starting to be a problem for other law enforcement agencies. Obviously, you know, the Libertarian Party is a political party. Any political party that's not talking about creating jobs, you're missing a big opportunity there. And through the legalization of drugs, what you're really looking to do is take illegal jobs and make them legal. You're looking to take this out of the underground market and out of the illegal sector and bring it above the table so that these people start paying taxes, so that they start having licensing requirements, so that they start having repercussions if they're selling to underage patrons. All of those things can only happen in a legal market by keeping these substances illegal. There's no reason for them to play by any rules, even if there aren't any rules to play by. One of the things that we've noticed recently in Illinois through the passage of our Medical Cannabis Pilot Program Act is that medical cannabis, lo and behold, is probably going to create some jobs. The way that the law was structured is that it's going to create jobs in parts of Illinois that nobody else is looking to create jobs. I was talking earlier to some folks about how the metropolitan area surrounding Peoria is really now a fight over who can get a cultivation center in their specific county. There's 3 state police districts that touch the Peoria area. Each of those state police districts has about 5 or 6 counties in it. Each of those state police districts is allowed only 1 cultivation center. These cultivation centers are going to be very large in Illinois, and you're starting to see these counties vying to have the cultivation center come to their county and not the neighboring county, because that's tax dollars that can stay in their coffers. It's more jobs that will be created for their county than others. And where we used to have no support at all for medical cannabis, let alone legalization, all of a sudden you have county boards actively recruiting some of these investors that are looking to invest anywhere from $8 to $15 million to build one of these cultivation centers and hire somewhere between 40 and 75 people. So when you go to places like Fulton County, Illinois, and say we're going to invest $12 million in a cultivation center here and hire 70 new people, they're going to bend over backwards and do whatever they can to make sure that you can do that in their county and not 3 counties over where they know that they're going to miss that opportunity there. Yes, ma'am?
So the cultivation centers are not going to be state-run, they're going to be privately run. Is that correct?
Absolutely. They will be run in conjunction and with some oversight by the Illinois State Police and that State Police District commander.
Okay,
but these are all private sector jobs. These are not public sector jobs.
I knew it was going to be with the state, in each state police district, but, and so I just automatically, from what everything I read in the paper was that I thought it was going to be all state-run and that it would be monitored by the state police, but it's not. I'm glad to hear it's private.
Yeah, it'll definitely be monitored by the state police, but these will all be private sector jobs.
I was very concerned if it was state-run. That I mean, like, what can go wrong with the state police to the facility, you know? So, okay, good. I'm glad to hear that.
I'm gonna go with the question in front because you already asked one. Yes.
Is a cultivation center a farm?
Yeah. It's just an indoor farm. It can't be grown outside.
Can't be grown outside.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
What's the political backstory behind why Illinois made the cultivation laws so expensive and difficult compared to what other states have done?
Well, one of it is to allow only the big fish an opportunity here, because they want to see this be a professional industry. Just because somebody is growing pot in their parents' basement doesn't mean that they should be allowed to grow medical cannabis for the people of Illinois that have cancer or multiple sclerosis. Part of that also is that given the limited amount of these licenses that are going to be available, the size and scope of these facilities are going to be quite significant. So the idea that we're going to give you a license, but if you don't have the capital to follow through on that license, it's just that type of a fiscal requirement to get even considered for one of these licenses. And just so everyone knows, the financial requirements for the cultivation centers are that you need to have $500,000 liquid assets, and the application fee is a $25,000 application fee. If they award you the license, it's $200,000 for the first year for that license, and that license is renewed at $100,000 per year. And again, this is because working to get cancer patients access to a plant took us over 10 years in Illinois. When we were advocating for a bill that was going to allow patients or caregivers to grow their own medicine, it was met with extreme resistance. We were, laughed at. We were chuckled. Oh yeah, you're going to grow your own medicine. Ha ha ha. Well, if you look at the states that allow for patient or caregiver cultivation, the price of the medicine is held in check then by the fact that people can grow their own. You see this in medical cannabis states. You see this also in recreational states, where the state of Colorado allows adults to grow 6 plants per adult or 12 per household, and that keeps the prices of the recreational cannabis in check in Colorado, whereas in Washington state, adults are not allowed to grow cannabis for their own personal consumption, and there's now a lot of gouging going on the prices in Washington state. There's also a shortage of the cannabis available. And this is something that, as we look at how cannabis prohibition is slowly ending, one of the things that Illinois NORML as an organization advocates for is for that personal right to be able to grow cannabis. I get all sorts of emails that are quite critical with some choice words about how if you pass any type of legalization law without allowing adults to grow this plant, you're still allowing a certain type of prohibition to exist.
Yeah.
You're still allowing for people to not have that ability to be able to be self-sufficient in a lot of ways. And I fully agree there. We already have legalization bills that will be introduced next spring in the Capitol. And one of the things that we are going to hold firm on is the ability for adults to grow cannabis in their gardens, in their houses, without those type of financial requirements or penalties for not abiding by the actual rules. And then the idea here is that what is the government's business how many cannabis plants I have or that I'm producing? There are certain laws and regulations about how much wine you can make in your house. There are certain laws about how much beer you can brew. But if we also take the historical record of how alcohol prohibition ended in the 1930s, it wasn't until the 1970s until people were allowed to home brew alcohol. And all that did was allow the brewers to get a stronger foothold on the market. They were able to really corner a lot of that market share. And even here in Illinois, where we have some of the strictest alcohol distributorship laws, it wasn't until about 10 years ago that you were actually able to get some of the microbrews and nano brews available in the city of Chicago. And now you notice it's a huge booming industry. Whether you're a hydroponics store like Home Brew and Grow, selling people the barley and malt to make their own beer in their basement, or whether you're an entrepreneur that wants to actually start your own brewing company, producing beer and alcohol for other adults to consume. All of these would create jobs, all of these would stimulate the economy, and all of these are not going to happen if you don't allow for that type of home cultivation. Yes, ma'am?
So making it so expensive and onerous in Illinois, was that done because that was the only way they felt that they were going to get this passed? Or was that done in order to protect, was this crony capitalism basically, in order to protect people who might want to benefit from this should the state regulate it? Because this is Illinois and crony capitalism is alive and well. I'm just wondering what the real story is behind this, because I can't believe that just concerns over quality was driving it.
Well, what it really was the agencies in charge of implementing this program. They drafted that in their rules and regulations. The Illinois General Assembly had nothing to do with the fiscal requirements to get one of these licenses. What it was essentially was the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Financial and Professional Regulations. They contacted other states that have medical cannabis and tried to learn from their mistakes. So for instance, in Arizona, they did a lottery system for who could open up a medical cannabis dispensary. And they issued 120 licenses for dispensary owners to be able to open up one of these businesses. Well, they found that after about 2.5 years, 80 of those 120 licenses never actually were able to open up because they weren't capitalized enough to be able to start a business. They were able to fill out the application, put their name in the hat, their name was drawn out of the hat, and then when it was their opportunity to open up this business, they just didn't have the money to open up the business. So that was part of the foundation for why they wanted to make these requirements so steep, as you might think of them as. But if you also look at the potential market here for medical cannabis patients in Illinois, we have the second largest population of any state that allows for medical cannabis. We also have probably one of the most restrictive laws that allows patients to get involved in this industry. But because there's only going to be 21 cultivation centers, they expected that these cultivation centers would have to be able to produce a significant amount of medicine if they were going to be able to supply what potentially could be a huge demand for it. So these are not cultivation centers that are going to be growing in a room like this. These are facilities that are going to be on the small end, 35,000 square feet, upwards to 125,000 square feet grow facilities. Yes, in the very back corner.
Who decided like what medical conditions were going to be allowed? And I know they just passed that addendum for kids with seizures or something like that. And like, do you see them adding more conditions or taking more away?
Yeah, that was the actual Illinois General Assembly, and I can tell you, being at that negotiating table, we used to have a lot less restrictions in this bill. We actually passed a bill in 2009 through the Illinois Senate that allowed for home cultivation. It allowed doctors to write a recommendation for profit, as well as for any condition that they felt necessary. We weren't able to get that bill through the House, and over that 5 years since then, they did have to make certain concessions to get the votes that we needed. So one of the things that got chopped off right away was mental health conditions, as well as chronic pain. That being said, we know that we can add some of these conditions. The first window for adding conditions will be in January. The state allows for a second window every year in July to be for conditions to be added. Essentially, if you want to get a condition added, the patient, in tandem with their doctor, will petition the Department of Public Health's Medical Cannabis Advisory Board, and that Medical Cannabis Advisory Board will rule one way or the other on adding that specific condition. Ultimately, though, the Department of Public Health Director can veto that condition being added if they so choose. And because the Department of Public Health's director is appointed by the governor, if we were to get an unfavorable governor towards medical cannabis in the governor's mansion, they really could stop this program in its tracks. We did see that happen in New Jersey, where the outgoing governor signed the legislation into effect. Chris Christie took over and basically said, I don't believe in medical pot, tough luck stoners with cancer, you're not going to be able to get this in New Jersey. And the New Jersey program has really been unsuccessful by most objective accounts. Was there another question? Yeah.
No, I'll say, we're about 2 more minutes.
Okay, well, we did a lot of good Q&A. The other thing I really want to hit home here with the war on drugs and liberty-based values, and you're starting to see this conversation renewed now after Ferguson, is the militarization of the police force in this country. When they're serving search warrants through flash grenades at 4 o'clock in the morning with assault rifles for non-violent drug crimes, there is a certain liberty and freedom being undermined there. And I put it on all of you to start voicing your concerns about why your local police force needs to have a tank and tactical weapons like that. So thank you all for having me here. I'll be here and answering questions in the hallway as well if people have more time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. It's about lunchtime, and I'm told it's in the Clover's room, which I think is that way. So next thing up is lunch. Enjoy.
Okay. Can we leave stuff here?
It sounds like we're still a long way from free.
Well, lunch,
The usual libertarian